This image, believe it or not, was taken with a digital camera with a focal length of 38 millimeter. Now, what does that mean, focal length of 38 millimeter? It means that the distance between the film gate and the lens, on the center of the lens, was 38 millimeter. How do I know that? Because here in Photoshop, I have the ability to go to File Info and get this window that explains to me exactly what was the focal length. It says that it was 6.2, and compared to 35 millimeters, I'm actually having 38 millimeter. Well, that's very vital information because I can take this into Maya as soon as I create the image plane. So right here in Maya, I already set up a camera, so go ahead and put a camera. You can find a camera under rendering, and this is a regular camera. And the first thing I need to do is to actually change the focal length from the default 35 to 38 millimeter. Now, the second thing I need to do is actually change the camera name here in the outliner to render cam, so whoever comes to work on the scene after me, they'll know exactly which camera needs to be rendered. Also, what I would like to do is change the near clip and the far clip planes on the camera. Near clip and far clip basically determine the area where the camera can see stuff. Basically, if I have an object close to the camera that is the distance between this object and the camera is less than this value, then the camera will become blind to it. So I need to lower this value to 0.01, and the far clip plane does the same thing as the near clip plane. If I have an object that is away from the camera and the distance is greater than this value, then the camera will basically be blind to it. It won't be able to see it. So I'm going to change this to a number with about 6 or 7 zeros. And the film gate resolution, fit resolution gate, I'm going to change it to horizontal because horizontal will allow me to see my image plane better. Now that I have the camera pretty much set up, I can go ahead and take my quad view here, and I can change the top view under panels perspective to what I see through the camera. Well, that's great because now I can go to view, image plane, import image, and bring the image that I took with my digital device. There it is. There it is. Great. So before I do anything else, what I would like to do is I would like to take my image plane and change a few things. For example, I don't need to see it in all views, so I can click on looking through camera only. Now, because this is a regular JPEG image, I don't have any alpha channel on it, I can change this to RGB with no alpha. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the depth. In other words, the distance between the camera and the image plane, something like 50,000. Why 50,000? Because I am not sure how big my geometry is going to end up. So last thing, I'm going to click here, I'm going to expand this, and I'm going to click on the film gate. Now I see that I have bars here and here. I need to fit this. So selecting the camera again, going to my right here to the camera aperture, I know that the Y is okay, but the X needs to be changed here on the camera aperture to 1.26. Why the value of 1.26? Because I experimented with this earlier and I saw that the value of 1.26 basically covers the image perfectly. And now what I need to do is I need to take the camera and push it up about 18 units on Translate Y. Now we're going to set up the height of the camera. The height of the camera should be about 18 Maya units. By default, Maya works in centimeters. So how did I come up with the number 18? In other words, 18 centimeters above the grid. Well, I'm about 5'10", and I took this photo standing up. That means that if I translate 5'10" to centimeters, then the camera should be about 180 above the grid. But if I do so and I take Translate Y and I feed 180 units into it, what happens is that the camera is going to be so high above the grid, it's going to be almost impossible to manage it. So just for the sake of the demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this value and divide it by 10, 18. There we go. Let me just zoom back into here. And the next thing we need to do is we need to set up proxy geometry that is going to simulate the ground. So I'm going to the Polygon tab here, and I'm going to create a polygon plane, just like that. And I'm going to the channels here. I'm going to go to the input channels, and I'm going to set up this polygon plane to be about 70 in size. And I'm going to add about 20 subdivisions on the width and height. Let's move the outliner over here. We can actually shrink this window a bit. This plane, I'm going to call this floor. You don't move the trees or the buildings around the camera. You actually move the camera until you get the right composition in your viewfinder. The same way here. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take the camera and I'm going to rotate it until I see my polygon plane. And that would be my floor. A lot of you might say, okay, so let's take the plane and rotate it. But I just explained that the plane should be flush to the ground. So I can take the camera, take the move tool or the translate tool. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to move the camera. Let me just expand this. So the corner here will actually be flushed with the corner of my polygon plane. So what I need to do, I need to have an area in where I can have a corner touching a corner, and I'll be able to snap the pivot point of the camera to this corner and rotate my camera around my geometry. Before I do that, what I need to do is to take my camera and create a rig to it. Now this rig has two purposes: to reset my pivot point of the camera and also protect the camera from any kind of further changes, which means the height should still be 18, and if I had any kind of animation on the camera, it should be protected from accidentally moving the camera or adding extra keyframes. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to group the camera into itself. So I'm going to the edit and group, and automatically my camera is being grouped into itself, and it says group 1. I can double click on this name and say camera rig. And by default, this pivot point of my grouped camera is on the 0 point of my 3D scene. Now I can take this pivot point and snap it into the further left corner of this plane. D on the keyboard, V to activate the magnet mode, and right there. Now I can rotate this camera around my plane until I get the right perspective. Rotate my grouped camera until I got the right perspective. At this point, what I can do is I can actually take my camera rig and lock the channels so I won't move it accidentally. So by clicking on the camera rig here in the outliner, let me just take the outliner down here. I can highlight, middle mouse button, click and drag. Highlight those channels, right click, and say lock selected. At this point, I can add proxy geometry, and this time this proxy geometry is going to simulate these three planters that you see here in front of you. All right, so I'm going to create a box over here. It's not going to be a big one. And I'm going to move it until I see it through the camera's viewfinder. Now, what I'm going to do is actually match this corner of the box to the corner of this middle planter. Right over here, just like that. And I'm going to take the pivot point of this box and snap it to that specific corner that I've just matched. So D on the keyboard, V for magnet or snap mode, snap it to that vertex. And going back to my camera view, and I see that in this box there's a little bit of a gap here. Might even need to move the box even further, just like that. But there's still a gap here because this box is a little bit rotated. So I'm going to take my rotation tool and I'm going to rotate it around the Y to make sure that it's flushed with what I see in the image. Perfect. Now I'm going to take my scale tool and make sure that this scale of a box will fit to what I see on screen. This is what we call set fitting, where basically we take proxy geometry and we are building the general idea of how things used to look like on set. Perfect box. Great. This cube or polygon cube, I can now call it planter underscore middle. And I can duplicate it and move it over here to represent the other planter. Now these planters, they don't sit in a straight line. One of them is rotated, the other one is pushed a little bit forward. So I can mimic that now. That's good. Looks very nice. But I see that I have some gap here. So in the same idea of taking the pivot point and changing it to a, let's call it a contact point. So I'm going back to my perspective, hitting D on the keyboard and the V, and I'm going to snap it to this corner right here. I'm snapping the pivot point to a new corner, and I'm going to rotate it just a tad. Now let me check through the viewfinder of the camera. Very nice. Matches. This duplicated planter, I can now change the name, planter underscore, instead of middle 1, I can say left because it's on the left side of the frame. Going back to the middle planter, the original planter, I can duplicate that one as well and move it to the planter that is here at the bottom right corner of the screen. Now, expanding this viewfinder, I see that it needs to be moved on the Z, just like that. Going back here, perfect. But again, with this planter that is not sitting in a straight line with the rest of these planters, I'm going to need to rotate it as well. So I'm taking my rotation tool and I'm going to rotate it until the lines match. I can continue and add more geometry in here as needed. For example, maybe this AC unit and this gated area. But I can also save this file, and the person that works after me in the production pipeline can simulate a lot of stuff here. For example, maybe there's some ants coming out of the planter, so you can simulate that. But at least they have a basic scene that I, as a match mover, started